Welcome. We are going to be discussing the women of the Bible, the direct line to Jesus, and the first person on that list is Eve. Our Bible references for this is Genesis 2 to 4, chapters 2 to 4, Corinthians 11:3, and 1 Timothy 2:13. Now, before we really dig into Eve, just some facts that you might find interesting. Did you know that there are at least 74 women in the Old Testament? At least. Did you know that there are 62 mentioned in the New Testament? For right at a total of 136 women mentioned in the Bible. And there are some others as well that really don't have their names mentioned, but they're in there. They're referenced too. So keep in mind that any and all work we do is by God's design and is considered service. As long as we are called by God to do a job, we are serving Him, and it becomes our act of worship. So remember that. If you're called by God to do a job, you are serving Him. Some things to consider and to think about as I discuss or I bring to you information on Eve. How does God bless Eve and forgive her? And how does the creation story give us hope of God's grace? Okay. So, who is Eve? Who is Eve? In Genesis 2:23, Adam is given the task of naming all creatures. And he said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." The first and most known woman in the Bible, in this book, is listed in Genesis 2:18, 2:23, 2:24. She is also addressed as Havah. She received her name Eve after her sin in Genesis 3:20. Her name means the mother of all who live. She is also known as the Blessed One. She did not receive her name Eve until both she and Adam had sinned against God. Until then, she was known as woman, helper of Adam. Eve was created by God as a way to provide Adam with a helper. Like a puzzle, and fitting two pieces together, Eve was made to fit Adam. So she was made to fit. In the Bible, the verb to make means to fashion, to fit it together, to fashion. Two things to remember about Eve. First, she got to taste paradise before sin. And second, she experienced the world after the initial sin. So she is the only female other than Adam, who is the male, to experience paradise before sin and the world after sin. Both she and Adam were able to call God by name in the Garden of Eden, where Seth's children will worship him, H-I-M, by name. And this is in Romans 5:19. And in 5:19 it says, "For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be righteous." Okay? Now, they've sinned. They leave the garden. You know the story. Eve gives birth to 3 children that we know of. 3. Cain, son of his father. He basically tends the land. Abel, the fleeting breath, tends the animals. And Seth, the appointed one. Now, you all know the story. Cain will kill Abel. Okay? Cain will kill Abel. Then Cain will leave the family home because he can't face anybody. He just can't face them and face what he did. So he leaves. Now, as a mother, one of the worst things that I could have happen is one child kill another. Much less the one that killed the other child is now gone. I didn't even get to see him. He's gone. So, in all honesty, I've lost 2 children, not just 1, but 2. So that leaves the birth of Seth. So now, Cain has gone, Abel is dead, Eve now gives birth to Seth. Now, through the birth of Seth, Eve is forgiven and blessed by God as the direct descendant of Jesus. So, she's gone through all of this. Now, we've had a 3rd child that we know of, and that child is now the direct descendant of Jesus along with Eve. Okay? So if you think about it, Eve had a major role to play in everything. So let's take a look at how Eve and Jesus will have very much similar things. Let's talk about temptation. The temptation, the appeal to physical appetite. In Genesis 3, basically, Satan comes to Eve and says, "You may eat of any tree." That's in Genesis 3:1. You can eat any tree. Ain't no problem there. In Jesus, in Matthew 4:3, it says, "And when the tempter came to him," talking about Jesus, he said, "If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made into bread." So he tempts Eve with the fruit, And he tempts Jesus with turning stone to bread. What about personal gain? That's a big temptation, personal gain. We always want to get personal gain. So in Genesis 3:4, Eve is told she'll never die. You eat this, you ain't gonna die. Whereas in Matthew 4:6, it says, and saith unto him, if thou shalt be the Son of God, cast them down, for it is written, he shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dost thy foot against a stone. He's saying, invoke your power. You can do it. Ain't got no problem. But then comes the power or glory. And in Genesis 3:5, Eve is told, you'll be like God. Eat this, you'll know God, you'll have his knowledge, you'll have his life, you'll be like him. And then in Matthew 4, Jesus, in Matthew 4:8-9, it says, again, the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and skeweth him all the kingdoms of the world. Showed him everything, and the glory of them, and said unto him, all these things I'll give them to you, if you wilt fall down and worship me. I'll give you all of this power and glory. But if you'll look, you'll see where Eve and Jesus both are tempted the same way. Now, not one person is all good, except Jesus, or all bad. This is seen in the complicated original story of the sin and grace, because you will see Eve is forgiven. How does knowing our fragility help understand God's grace? If I know that I am fragile, that I am subject to temptation, I will give in. Ain't no doubt about that. But how great is God's grace? Can you imagine what it would feel like to experience paradise and then have it ripped away just for committing a sin? What about losing your child or your children? Can you imagine the heartbreak? So let's think about what it says about God, that he would allow Eve, the mother of sin, to become the ancestor of the one, Jesus, who eventually overcomes our sins. Just think about it. Do you have control of those around you? Do we let others control us? I know I do. How do you think God will want you to change? Just think about it. Consider it. I ask God to give you all grace and peace and love, and hope and understanding in maybe hearing something. God bless you and keep you. Next, we'll be talking about Zillah, which is in Genesis 2:24 and Genesis 4:19-23. Peace be with you. Go in God's grace.